light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Within modern life, it seems that things are so often compartmentalized, and we want to deal with this over here and that over there, and this is the societal philosophy, regardless of what anyone's personal philosophy is, and this is the way everything is supposed to be. And I'm reminded of a gay man whom I still consider my big brother in a sense, even though we're not at all related, who made the comment to me at the very beginning, never should on yourself. And so I try to avoid the word should whenever I can, and yet there are times where it's the only word that will do. And I guess a lot of my show is also telling people we should behave this way and we should behave this way. We should behave that way, and the government should do this. And in my personal opinion, the military should be only for defense, never aggressive or initiating conflict. And if we could ever get to that point of understanding that the military is for protection, it's not for attacking somebody because we want more. That if we want more and we're attacking, that points to the mental illness of greed and the mental illness of narcissism or being selfish. That when it is a mental illness, and I don't think I'm stretching to say that, because it's a mental illness that thinks for a moment that one can actually survive without the other. It's like saying, I don't want any plants anywhere on my property. No, none in my house, nowhere on my property, and if possible, nowhere in the world. Well, the problem with that is that plants generate oxygen, which is breathed by humans. If you eliminate all the plants, all the people die, because it's a symbiotic relationship. And the problem with not having compassion, with being hard-hearted, with assuming that someone's death doesn't matter, is not taking into account what that person may have otherwise contributed. If someone saves someone from a fire, for example, I saw a movie once where there was a homeless person who ran into a building and saved someone from being killed in a fire. It kind of, well, on a similar but different note, it kind of goes back to the movie It's a Wonderful Life starring Jimmy Stewart, in which he gets to see what the world would be like if his life were removed. And when at one point he's saying, well, why didn't this happen? And the angel says, well, you weren't there to rescue him, so he wasn't there to rescue them. That never happened, and that never happened, and this never happened. And because you weren't there to make these loans at the Bailey Savings and Loan, that meant that Bailey Park never happened. Instead, it became Potterville, which was this horrendously oppressive place where nobody had any love anymore. And I guess what is all the more tragic to me is not recognizing how horrible a world without love is, and how it really is one of the early indications of mental illness when you find someone who is unable to love, unable to forgive, unable to get past a particular wound, when it's a psychological and emotional wound that will not heal because there is something that it needs that it is not getting. You know, in the same way that if you want someone to heal physically, you have to provide a healthy diet with adequate protein and all the things that the body uses to rebuild that wounded part. In a similar sort of way, there are emotional and psychological and spiritual things that need to be provided so that the soul of the person is able to heal that part that has been wounded. And if they're not, then they will never get past it. Or the likelihood is that they will never get past it. So when when one finds someone who is unable to love, and when one finds someone who is unable to forgive or unable to move on with their lives after a particularly devastating thing has happened, that really is an emergency. It may not be physical, but it is no less damaging to the person and every person that person will affect. If something had happened to George Bailey in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where he had suffered an emotional wound that was so devastating that he was not able to have healthy relationships with anybody, then he would not have been able to have a healthy relationship with his wife or with his brother or with any of the rest of the town, that ultimately his life made a difference in their lives and changed the entire face of his community. And I guess you could say changed history, at least at a local level. All of that is so important to bear in mind when I look at people experiencing misfortune, experiencing poverty, that these things are and being different simply by being who he was. The thing about George Bailey, I guess, is that he was white like most of the other people in his town, not all of them, but most of them. And yet, in other ways, he was different. He chose to fix up an old house. He chose to marry a particular woman. He chose to respond in particular ways, that when everyone said, it's your turn, go off, have your vacation, have a honeymoon, be successful, whatever, and this crisis hit, and 2 or 3 times he said, no, I can't do what I was going to do without, I can't turn my back on all these people that I care about. I have to do what I can, what only I can do. And so he set aside his own wishes. He chose not to be narcissistic and to be community-oriented and to be a servant to his community. And in so doing, he allowed his community to survive. And if he had not made that personal investment, his community would not have survived. And people encouraged him, to be selfish and do, you've earned this, do it. And he's saying, no, I can't. I could not in good conscience do that, no matter how much I deserve it. And in that sense, by taking what he was able to do and putting love where love would otherwise not be, he was able to take misfortune and poverty and difference and transform it into something empowering and good that far exceeded anything he could do on his own. It took his whole community working together, but it took him investing his love and commitment and dedication and service in order for his community to become the community that it ultimately became. Even to the point that it inspired the tax auditor at the end of the movie, who, as his final act, dropped the paperwork in the basket and walked out, making it clear that he was not going to pursue the negative action that precipitated most of the movie. Even the least likely person was also swept up in the love and the community spirit and the people collaborating and coming together that that ultimately was the product of all the investment of himself that George Bailey did within that movie. All of this leaves me very sad in my present time as I look around me and see how often misfortune and poverty and difference are essentially treated as if they were crimes, that people are penalized for their entire lives just because they're different. That, even for myself, and it's not only about me, it's about everyone who's ever had this situation, but even in my own life, my entire adult life doesn't have any career-oriented position because no one was willing to hire an autistic. No one was willing to give me a wage that would pay, an income that would pay a living wage. And because of that, I had to make do in other ways, and I had to find things that would work, and alternatives, and workarounds, and people would say, well, there's no way to do whatever, and I found a way. a way that they would not have considered because it required hard work and investments that most people weren't willing to do. But I specifically embraced that because I was not willing to consider poverty a crime. That just because they're poor doesn't mean they're bad. Just because they experience misfortune doesn't mean they're bad. Just because they're different doesn't mean they're bad. I think someone should listen to them and love them. The image that just flashed through my mind was a Charlie Brown Christmas. Toward the end there, where they're finding this little Christmas tree that is in such horrible condition. And Linus goes up to it and says, it's not really such a bad little tree at all. I think it just needed a little love. And he wraps his blanket around the base of it. And that is what tips the balance. And everyone else begins to see how all it takes is a little personal investment. And this tree that by itself is neglected and rejected and marginalized can instead be the most beautiful tree. And it can be a tree that inspires collective singing when you sing with somebody else, not just singing a solo, not just mumbling a curse phrase, but singing a joyful song together, and finding that when we all come together, it's so much more powerful than if we have to stand alone or when we try to face a difficulty all on our own. There were difficulties that I faced, and I think in every case I got much further than anyone ever expected I would. But ultimately I could not succeed without the support of others. And when they chose to withhold their support, those experiences ended badly and tragically, and I had to endure loss and restart my life again and try to rebuild again. And yet, in looking back at that, it's so sad, and yet the thing that keeps coming to the front is that it wasn't really about the fact that it ended badly. It was about the fact that I was willing to try. And it was the fact that I did more than anyone thought I could do. And in so doing, whether they ever pay attention or not, I don't know. But I gave them an example that it could be done, that it's not impossible, that there are alternatives if we remember to love each other first and let the policies and the procedures and the programs, let them all follow love, not precede it. Because when those things precede love, then you have power subverting love. And essentially thereby making them a crime. When power leads, misfortune becomes a problem because you don't have the money to pay for it anymore. There was one time where I was in an older vehicle, and I'm not a mechanic, so I didn't know what to watch. But as I was driving down the highway, there was a ball joint at the front that literally came apart. It wasn't bent, it wasn't scraped, it wasn't scratched. It just literally came apart. The bolt came off and the whole thing came apart, and suddenly at 50 miles an hour, the wheel went from vertical to 45-degree angle, and the truck spun around about one full time, I think, and then slammed into a guardrail. Remarkably, I didn't hit anything except the guardrail. But the point of that was that this was a truck I valued very much. I just didn't know how to maintain it. I didn't hit anything. But the first officer who stopped at the scene immediately tried to blame me for what happened and insisted that I must have been drinking. No, smell my breath if you want. I haven't been drinking. Well, it must be this. It must be, you must have done something wrong. He decided to issue me a court summons instead of just a warning or just he was not concerned about my welfare. He was concerned about reporting an accident in a way that blamed me, that my misfortune was somehow a crime. And then he wanted to insist on resources I didn't have, and I said, well, then let me get my stuff out of the truck and I'll walk home. Well, you can't do that, Ron. Well, if you're not going to give me a ride and I don't have the money for a taxi, how in the world do you want me to disappear? You want me to just vaporize or die here on the roadside or what? And he really had no answer for me whatsoever because he was trying to treat my misfortune as if it were a crime. And in the end, when I basically threw the question to him and said, I don't have anything, what do you want to do? The officer ultimately decided that he would give me a ride even though it really wasn't within the policy or whatever. And like, I don't care. I'm just trying to get home. That's all it is. This experience of misfortune was extended for 2 months until I finally showed up in municipal court, explained the whole situation to the judge. The district attorney was looking for some way to convict me of something that I hadn't done and kept trying to find ways to do it wrong. And he asked me a question. I attempted to answer it, and he didn't like my answer, and he kept interrupting. And I finally said, do you want me to answer this or not? And he said, question withdrawn. And because very often citizens are at odds with their judicial and legal systems, the administrators who are trying to serve their own purposes, but are not beginning with love. And by not beginning with love, they're taking my misfortune and making it a crime. And thankfully, the judge in that instance was able to see through it all. And after presenting everything and going through all the set procedure and what can be presented at what time, and I gave the judge a photograph of the ball joint that showed how it wasn't scratched or scraped or anything, it was just disassembled, and that was what it called the whole thing, caused the whole thing. And that if this had happened, if that had happened, it would have still been an accident because the ball joint would have still come apart. And I was very exasperated with the whole thing. But thankfully, the judge looked at all the evidence, reviewed all the evidence, went through the whole thing, and then just simply pronounced, the city has failed to prove its case, you're free to go. And I was like, wow. And I think the district attorney just sat there with his mouth open. But it was really a very pathetic case with no evidence, and yet they were still trying to treat it as if it was a crime. And I don't mean to belabor all that or to say, oh, poor little me. It's not about poor little me. It's about noticing the dynamics that are happening. It wasn't about me or them. It's not about the identity of the perpetrator or the victim. It's about the nature of the action. When the nature of the action views misfortune and poverty and difference as being crimes, when the fact of this difference in identity promotes or somehow encourages a negative dynamic, that the negative dynamic is what's wrong, not the identities. It wasn't wrong because of who I was, and it wasn't wrong because of who the district attorney was. It was wrong because it was the wrong way to behave. Racism isn't wrong because it's this kind of victim and that kind of perpetrator. Racism is wrong because it's a bad way to behave. It doesn't matter who you are or who the other person is, it's a bad way to behave in every instance. The challenge to the current generation is moving our societies from a place where misfortune and poverty and difference are treated as crimes to a place where these are instead regarded as resources and as opportunities. Another movie that comes to mind, but I don't know if it's even available in its original form anymore because it's been edited by some religious right organization that took all the questionable pieces out. I believe it was called Griffin, and there's a substitute teacher in an inner city school named Miss Ferenzi. And at one point, she has changed their thinking and inspired them to, instead of doing graffiti on the side of an abandoned building, they do a beautiful mural that is inspirational and beautiful and well done. And it was created by collaboration of, I think, 15 to 20 kids in the classroom. That this is their project, and they figured out how to do it, and they did it, and they executed it beautifully. And at the end, there was this beautiful mural on the wall, and the principal shows up and is outraged that they have painted, this is graffiti, because she can't see the beauty of it, and drags the substitute teacher into the school and fires her. You're out of a job, you're unemployed, get out of here, I don't want to see you again. And so she's leaving in her car. The kids in the class, the youth in the class stop her and say, but this is so wrong. She should not be doing this to you. And Miss Ferenzi says, if I remember it correctly, what seems um, what seems tragic, what initially seems tragic, often works out for the best, though it may not be obvious at the time. And she leaves. And 5 minutes later, the superintendent shows up. And the principal comes running out to apologize for this defacing of the side of the building and whatnot. And he ignores everything she says and simply says, "This is beautiful. This is an inspiration to our children. They did this themselves. How incredible. These kids deserve to be rewarded." And so, of course, then they try to find Miss Ferenczi afterwards, but they can never find her. And the supposition, of course, is that she was actually an angel. But I try to wrestle with that phrase again and again. What seems bad initially often works out for the best, though it may not be obvious at the time. And how do we learn to trust that? And how do we learn to steer it in the right direction? And if it doesn't happen that way, do we assume that we're not at the end yet? That, in losing, in all the experiences of loss I've had in the last 5 years, losing a sense of home and the getting further than anyone thought I could, but still having an administrator saying, "You're not good enough, you're different. Until you're exactly like us, you have to be marginalized, penalized, punished, whatever." And recognizing that I may still be in the middle of the story, I may not be at the end yet, and that all of these things have made me into a different person than I would otherwise be, that they have created sensitivities and understandings and a commitment to dealing with relationships that maybe I didn't have before. I don't remember if I did or not. A commitment to dealing with communication that maybe I didn't have before. I don't know. I thought I did. And I would like to think that there were other ways that didn't involve so much loss that I could have learned those things. But one way or the other, I'm still in the middle of it, saying maybe it'll turn out for the best. I don't know. And I'm not willing to promise myself the worst. And I'm not willing to punish other people simply for being different or poor. That regardless of who I meet, regardless of what situation, I'm going to do everything I can to help them, because I want to lead with love. I don't want to take love out of the picture and then wonder why something bad resulted. When you take love out, it's unavoidable that misfortune, poverty, and difference will become crimes for which people can be punished. And which without love, society would say, well, they should be punished. They broke the rules. And instead of looking in the mirror for a moment and wondering whether the rule might be wrong. The rule might be wrong if it's creating people who are impoverished, if it's creating more misfortune. The rule might be wrong. If it's not creating genuine solutions, if it's not creating love, the rule might be wrong. And the policy might be wrong. And the program might be wrong. And trying to take a step back and figure out what was it we were trying to solve in the first place, because I think we've gotten off track. But until you stop and do that kind of self-evaluation and that kind of analysis of what is really going on here, to recognize when something bad happens, there's usually a cause for it. I don't generally believe in uncaused effects, things that happen without having been caused by something. So if there's something bad, and if we agree that misfortune and poverty and marginalizing someone because they're different, if we agree that marginalizing and misfortune and poverty are all bad things, then we have to look at why those things even happen, because we definitely have the intelligence and the ability, spiritually and socially and emotionally, we have the ability to prevent those things from happening. And if they're not happening, why are they not happening? And instead of looking down on the person who has experienced misfortune, the person who was in a car accident, being there with compassion to say, how can I help? Instead of, how can we penalize you? How can we blame you for the fact that this happened? To instead say, what do you need? How can I provide that? And to begin with love instead of beginning with power, instead of arriving on the scene and saying, I outrank you, you are now going to be further punished in the way that I decree, for no other reason than to validate the fact that I'm more powerful than you. And that is so mentally sick, that is so wrong, to instead come to every hurting person and say, you are loved, and now that I'm here, you're safe. And we're going to find an answer that works for you. Instead of allowing misfortune and poverty and difference to be crimes, to instead insist on each of those being an opportunity. This is an opportunity for me to understand what it is to help somebody. This is an understanding for me to learn. This is an opportunity, rather, for me to learn what it is to share, and how in mutual sharing we both get our needs met. I have a sense of purpose and meaning in my life. I have a smile on my face because I helped somebody. Or I met somebody who's totally different than I am, and I learned that they are a fascinating, amazing, and talented person. That there are things that this person can do that until now I couldn't do. And when certain opportunities arose, I had to say, sorry, not for me, I can't do it. Deplorable situation, they were able to take all the resources and transform them into a new sense of family that spreads the love around. When we end with love, when we begin with love, when we saturate with love, things turn out right. Thank you so much for watching.